Hello, my name's Mike Church, and I'm going to be answering some questions, of which you've probably had the first one flashing across the top of the screen, posed by Taz. And I want to pay a big tribute to Taz because I think putting together this YouTube channel, Just Another Poet, is a really great idea, and good on you. Because I've looked at other videos and it's really interesting to see other writers talking about their work, talking about their inspiration, their motivations, and their identity as a writer. And so I'm going to try and just be as honest as I can and give you as much input on where it's taken me. And obviously I'm very old and wrinkled now. Wise? I don't know. But the first question is, when did you first realise that you were a poet or writer? Now there's an identity tag I've struggled with for a long time, because I do get hung up on all this sort of like class thing about, high culture, low culture, and from a family that's been on the tools for most of their life, tarmackers, and then my father was an electrician. My father climbed out of what was very, very working class background, and then was self-educated. I really admire my dad. He's been dead quite a long time now, but he joined the forces, was in the Second World War, but he was self-taught and motivated to learn huge chunks of Shakespeare and huge, volumes of poetry, and he just knew them off by heart. Andrew Marvell to his coy mistress, just brilliant, and anyway, he gave me the first experience of writing for pleasure when he gave me a diary. He presented me a diary when I was about 8. He did it to my brother and sister as well, and said, look son, this is, you do some writing on this, just capture some thoughts, some ideas when you feel like it, maybe just a diary entry, whatever. And it was great, and I've still got it, and I've still got the very early entries from when I was 8 and whatever, and it's just really interesting. That was the first time I wrote for pleasure, not writing because I was forced to write with a gun to my head by a teacher or something. I was writing for pleasure, and he taught me about reading for pleasure as well, and I'm indebted to him for that. So when did I first consider? Then you come to the point when, for me, writing has become a living, so it is the tag I have to attach to myself, because it is how I make my living and have for the last 12 years. I was a teacher before that for many years too. So yeah, I've been doing it then, and come on to that, because when you have to make a living out of writing, you're not doing it quite so much. It's still very enjoyable. It's a fantastic way to make a living, but it's also, you're not doing it just for, you have to grab every opportunity, and like, oh, have you ever written newspaper? Yeah. Have you ever written? Yeah, done that, yeah. Because you're just always trying to sort of get a living. So when did I first? Firstly, as a child, I wrote for pleasure, and then latterly, about 12 years ago, I've done it exclusively as a living. I'll come on talk more about that perhaps. Right, okay. The rewards and challenges of working with children and young adults. Just to say, I've spent most of my life through education and as a writer working with children. A lot of it's working with children, and the rewards, they're just fantastic. Recently, in this lockdown period, I've been reading lots of stories, children's picture books that I've been writing. I've written over the years with Petra Publishing, and they've been read in various outlets during this lockdown, so libraries, schools, all sorts of places. I had a lovely little video message back from a little kid, because one of the books is called Why Can't I Win? And it tries to help children with that idea of when you lose games and not having to throw the whole game up in the air and out the window and punch people, and learning how to lose, and the respect and dignity of that. And this little girl, lovely little girl, sent a message through her mother and saying, oh, I'd just like to say I know how to lose now, and just nice. It's just really nice. And when you think Dylan Thomas, there's a quote from Dylan Thomas saying that he first fell in love with words when he was a child with nursery rhymes, and he said didn't know what the words meant. He just fell in love with words, and he had that enduring relationship that we all have with words and how to use them and bash them around a bit. And I think I've spent most of my time. The reward is watching children who might get to fall in love with words and articulate a little sentence or phrase, or understand something. I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, I did a year teaching in the Sudan in the early 1980s, just around the time when Band Aid and Sudan was suffering enormously at that time, and still is. And I have to say, it was probably, looking back, it was a bit of post-colonial, patriarchal. Here's a little bit of, we'll send some teachers. I wasn't a teacher, I didn't know my arse from my elbow. But one of the great things that happened out there with these fantastic Sudanese youngsters working with, we were doing an abridged version of Tale of Two Cities. And one of them came up to me at the end of the lesson, 60 youngsters in a class, and one of them came up and said, Mr. Michael, this Charles Dickens man, really good. I love that sentence. And this is an abridged version, right? I love that sentence where they rose up in Paris and it was like a forest of bare arms rising up for their freedom. Something like that. But I just thought he grasped that love of language and that, and he's just wonderful. And years later then, when I was working in a special school for children with behaviour difficulties, chair chuckers and all sorts, and fantastic kids, wonderful kids, and I loved them, and I mean that in a proper, respectful teacherly way. But these kids, I was working with some youngsters, some tough lads, on trying to get a few of them to do a GCSE in English, and we were looking at To His Coy Mistress, which I've mentioned earlier with my father, and they were like, well, what's this all about then, Churchy? What's this, To His Coy Mistress? I said, well, really, it's all about bonking and why you can't, don't waste your time, get on with it, come on, right? And they loved it, and they really engaged with the poem. And one of them said, yeah, that's... and on my back I always hear Time's winged chariot. That's like death, isn't it? Death's always with you. It's chasing you all through your life, isn't it? And just their engagement of bits like that is just brilliant. And my biggest sort of selling success as a writer is one of the picture books, which is... about dementia, tries to help children understand the theme of dementia, really. And it's a lovely story about a grandfather elephant and a little grandson elephant, and I've been going into schools with that, and it's there's 11,000 copies of it. I don't get the profits that have been sold, but it's been really big, and going into schools and trying to help kids grapple with those issues. And I had a lovely thing. I was in Caerphilly Castle doing a workshop, something there, and last summer, and obviously can't do it this summer, and a mother came up with her son, and the son said, I know you came to our school and we got that book from you, that The Elephant Who Forgot book. And the mother came up and said, he's never stopped talking about that, and I want to tell you about it because his aunt got dementia and he just couldn't get his head around what it all meant. And then you went to the school, did this dementia workshop, and the book, they gave him a copy of the book, and he said, I really get it now, Mum. And she said, not only that, the biggest thing I want to say thank you for is that you should see the relationship he's got with his aunt now. He's absolutely brilliant with her, and and it's just changed the whole dynamic. Now I know I don't mean to blow in my own trumpet, but what I mean is the power of words and the rewards of working with children. If you can get children to fall in love with words and books and turn a phrase, that's got to be worth something, hasn't it? In my book it has, and that's all I've tried to do. The challenges are often, you've got, we live in times where screen culture is everywhere. And worse than screen culture, what screen culture gives you is these abominable marketeers and advertisers and these slogans, let's get Brexit done and all that. And it cheapens language, and it cheapens it to the marketplace and monetisation of language. And that annoys me, and I think that's a challenge for us as writers when we're trying to enthuse kids and get kids reading and reading for pleasure and all the benefits that undoubtedly brings in terms of, life expectancy, academic achievement, brings everything. So yeah, the rewards, brilliant. I wouldn't swap, having done things with working with kids, wouldn't swap it for anything. And the challenges, they continue, and let's try and move the Brexit done and all that. And it cheapens language, and it cheapens it to the marketplace and monetisation of language, and that annoys me, and I think that's a challenge for us as writers when we're trying to enthuse kids and get kids reading and reading for pleasure and all the benefits that that's undoubtedly brings in terms of, life expectancy, academic achievement, brings everything. So yeah, the rewards, brilliant. I wouldn't swap, having done things with working with kids, wouldn't swap it for anything. And the challenges, they continue, and let's try and move the direction of society into making everyone readers for pleasure. Because I think if everyone read for pleasure, I don't think the world would be a problem. You only have to look at Donald Trump and you recognise, don't you? There's a man who doesn't read. Says it all, doesn't it? This next question is about a stalwart, it's a great word, isn't it? Stalwart of poetry slams and the performance poetry in your early career. I didn't even know I had an early career, but anyway, I did do a lot of poetry slams in the 1990s when they were big in the UK, and took part in the first ever UK National Poetry Slam at the Bristol Watershed Centre in 1997, I think it was, and represented Wales. It's like, I like to think of it as a Welsh cap, and in a team, represented Wales and Cardiff, and we got to the final, but Bristol won. I'm not bitter, no. I liked slam poetry and did a lot of it in the 90s, and got to do a lot of performing, and then during that period was when I got to work with lots of Jake Thackeray, Ian Macmillan, Adrian Mitchell. What a lovely man Adrian Mitchell was, and I've got his book, and he wrote a little thing he gave me a book when we were doing something, and just lovely man. And so, no, I like the performance poetry. There's all this thing about writing, isn't there, about the written page and the performance, and sometimes those two things, you can see the line of it. Dylan Thomas, having mentioned him before, great performance, through to Ginsberg and the beat poetry, then through to the Liverpool poets, and then you go up to Holly McNeish and Kate Tempest, your Sleaford mods. Performance is an integral part, and actually I think the whole writing and poetry is a broad enough church for a whole continuum of different approaches. So yeah, I enjoyed the performance bit, and it appeals. It still appeals, and even now I still think performance is just a lot of fun, and should be fun, and not taken. Sometimes you take things seriously, literature should be taken very seriously. Sometimes it should be taken sort of with a pinch of salt. And I always found with the slams that it wasn't really competition, it wasn't really about winning, and it was just about having fun and getting together with a format that was just a bit of sort of like jockey, and it was good fun. So yeah. Well, who or what are great influences? Well, I'm going to try and keep this one short again. But no, I've talked about my father, who was a real influence, and but then in terms of, I think you're influenced all the time. You mentioned the sort of the modern day performance stuff, and you mentioned Dylan Thomas going back a bit further, and you go. Somebody sent me the other day. A friend of mine sent me. Have you seen this version of but still I rise, the Maya Angelou, and I'd not seen her one performance of her doing it, and that's inspirational, isn't it? It's inspirational, and then words on the page inspire you. So I know we're going to talk about that, but I think you're always being inspired. You're always being inspired, and you seek out inspiration. You follow threads. And the great thing about the internet, see, I'm not anti-technology. Great thing about internet is you can follow threads, and you can do research so easily nowadays, and you can look up things that you didn't know, little gaps in your knowledge base, and So I think you're constantly inspired, and should be. So I didn't, for example, I'm reading a Zadie Smith, that's right, yeah, book's over here, Zadie Smith, and I'm reading that novel at the moment, and didn't realise that her husband was Nick Laird, and been listening to his poetry recently. Really interesting, really nice. So you're constantly inspired. Different things spark you to look at things. You're always inspired, aren't you? Working on any writing projects presently? Well, yes, a few things are cropping up during this lockdown period. So I'm doing a thing for Bridgend, which is a written word and performance, hosting a little thing there on a Friday afternoon. I'm doing a children's picture book about, sort of loosely based on coronavirus, because you don't want to go through all the cliches of that, but um, it's about that. So his children's picture book is going to be is that, and it's very interesting to do working with a group of people on a Zoom type meeting, and that's an interesting format because normally a lot of it's face to face. So yeah, working on a few things, and done Rhondda Arts Festival up in Treorchy, done poems for there, and yeah, doing lots of libraries, and not always, just stuff that people ask you. So I've had quite a few schools, quite a few library services asking, "Oh, Mike, will you read a story?" And you just get involved in. It's shifted and changed, and it's done like this. You can't go near anyone. You've just got to do it remotely on a computer. But yeah, you get involved in whatever, don't you? If somebody asks me to be a horse, I'll neigh. So that's how cheap I am. Sorry. Right, favourite poets, past or present? Well, I think I've mentioned lots of people during the course of this discussion, monologue. I don't know. Anyway, I think I've raised a few. So I just Maya Angelou I mentioned, Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. I like the whole um, relationship dynamic with them, and the tragedy, and talking openly about mental health with Sylvia Plath, and fantastic. The skin as bright as a Nazi lampshade. Fantastic sort of phrases that come to mind with her. And then you've got I mentioned Andrew Marvell to his Coy Mistress. I think that I know it's a bit classic, but some poems. And I first fell in love, I have to say, when I was in school, when I first came across Wilfred Owen, Stuttering Rapid Rifles. I just, that was when I fell in. Dylan Thomas talks about nursery rhymes. I remember Dylan Thomas and thinking, wow, someone who actually, fighting and coming up with that, and the wonderful Dulce et Decorum Est. It's just fantastic. And then later, when I was doing my teacher qualification with the lecturer there, turned me on to the Bertolt Brecht poetry, which I didn't know about. Bertolt Brecht, obviously famously as a dramatist, but his political poetry, and you've got to be careful, haven't you, with political poetry. But a lot of my adult stuff is sometimes has a political element to it, and Bertolt Brecht wrote some fantastic political poetry on the death of the indispensable man. If he comes back a week later, wouldn't get a job as a hall porter, even though the indispensable man, if he frowns, two empires quake. But if he came back in 2 weeks, wouldn't get a job as a hall porter. Bertolt Brecht, fantastic. And Dylan Thomas, I mentioned, there's just where do you? I mean, you have to be eclectic. You have to read widely, and I enjoy, and I'll look up anything that's someone says, try this, Mike. I'll have a. You got to, haven't you? You've got to just enjoy, and it comes back to that enjoyment and passion and fun and being turned on by words, reading, performing, writers. I love them all because we're all writers together, aren't we? And there's enough room in the universe for all of us. Well, it's been very lovely. Thank you again, Taz. And sorry if I've waffled and gone too long, but cheers.